event. Welcome, Emily. Let's go back to the start when we first met as executive directors on the board of what was known then as the Society for Dance History Scholars, now the Dance Studies Association. For our attendees who may be new to your work, when did your interest in Chinese dance begin to emerge in your studies?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone for joining us. So I think my interest in dance and Chinese studies, as well as dance theory, kind of happened separately from each other and eventually merged. So like a lot of young girls in the United States, I was sent to ballet class from a young age, about 5 years old, and I studied ballet throughout primary school for about 6 years, performed in many Nutcracker performances and things like that. And then I took a break from dance and I got back into it as an undergraduate at Harvard University. I joined the ballroom dance team, or the diasporic competitive circuit at that time. And it was actually through that I had the opportunity 20 years ago now to take my first trip to China. So I was actually just looking through this magazine, Amateur Dancers, where I published an article about this trip to China in the winter of 2002. So that was my first time really getting exposure to Chinese dance. But I was interested in dance theory and theories of the body and theories of experience and the politics of performance. I was fortunate to be introduced to medical anthropology, which has a strong line of theories of corporeality as an undergraduate. And I also was fortunate enough to take a dance studies course, a seminar also as an undergraduate. And through those courses, at the time I was an anthropology major, and I also was very interested in social theory and political and social movements. And so all of those things together, as well as a number of courses on Chinese history and culture, started to kind of push me in the direction, I would say, of dance studies. And as an undergraduate, I wrote my first research paper actually on dance and politics in contemporary France, and got some experience with ethnographic research, which I really enjoyed, as well as some of the second half of the 20th century, the way that dance and politics had intersected in the European context. And that also laid a really important foundation for my later study of Chinese dance. So it was really, as a master's student, I studied at Cambridge and I did an MPhil in the history and philosophy of science, continuing my interest in histories of sort of theories of health. And specifically at the Needham Research Center, I had the opportunity to research the history of Chinese medicine and its interaction with Western medicine. And that provided interesting theoretical questions as well for my later research. But it wasn't until I was a PhD student at the University of California, Berkeley, that I realized there was so much potential for research in Chinese dance specifically. And fortunately, I was encouraged by one of my faculty members, Andrew Jones, who is a scholar of Chinese music, who really said, this is a field that has not been researched, and you have so much background in dance and dance studies that you would really be an ideal person to do this. And so he encouraged me to venture into this territory. So it was as a doctoral student around 2004 or 2005 that I started to shift gears and really focus on Chinese dance as my research focus.
I mean, that's a wonderful precursor into trying to sort of get a further insight into your first book, Revolutionary Bodies. I mean, it marks your distinction as a scholar in East Asian studies. Could you talk us through, I know you've given us a bit of a sort of trajectory through your postgraduate studies, but how did your research evolve, particularly in the light of revolutionary bodies? Can you explore a little bit further with your anthropological ethnographic research dimension, but also your study at the Beijing Dance Academy and regionally in China through your Fulbright scholar?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I would love to. So I did start studying Chinese language as an undergraduate and continued that throughout grad school. So I was a PhD student in the anthropology program, and then China was my area specialty. So I was training very intensively in Chinese, which included coursework during the academic year, as well as intensive programs every summer. So starting in 2005, I believe, that was the first of many summers that I spent in Beijing doing intensive language training. And then, of course, while I was there, I was exploring the dance scene. So I started my ethnographic research sort of informally at that stage as a language student. I was dancing at the local ballroom studios. I was attending performances. And in 2006, I started taking my first Chinese dance class, which was a class that was just offered to adults on the weekend. It was not at the Beijing Dance Academy at that point. It was actually at a modern dance company. But that cultivated my interest in the foundation for the networks that I built upon when I was doing full-time research. So as you said, in 2008, I was a Fulbright scholar at the Beijing Dance Academy. And that in itself was actually quite a feat. It took about 2 years to get permission from the Beijing Dance Academy to actually be an enrolled student there. So I was a full-time student, paying tuition and attending classes alongside the professional dance students, which is a really important part of my research methodology. So as a dance ethnographer, I used embodied practice as a core research method. So I was training in Chinese dance, classical dance technique, as well as the Shen Yun, which is also a kind of technique program for Chinese classical dance. I also took 3 semesters of Chinese classical dance water sleeve, Chinese classical dance sword, as well as a number of different folk and ethnic dance forms, such as Uyghur dance, Dongbei Yangge, Korean dance, Mongolian dance. And so together, all of this embodied training really became the window through which I gained expert understanding of Chinese dance as a conservatory dance practice. And we all know there's so much conveyed in the studio that really doesn't even appear in a dance textbook written by the same teacher. There's so many aesthetic terminologies, metaphors that come out in the training, and also so much of the cultural background that I was exposed to through the physical practice of dance. So that was the core, I would say, of my initial research during my dissertation research time back in 2008 and 2009, when I was a full-time student at the Beijing Dance Academy. And then, of course, because the Academy is the center of this nexus for a dance community throughout China, you constantly have choreographers, students, and scholars coming through that space. So through being a student there and living there on campus, I was able to watch so many performances, hear lectures, listen in on courses that I was not necessarily enrolled in, and then also conduct oral history interviews with my faculty as well as other affiliated scholars and students. So in addition to the experience-based participant observation at the Dance Academy, I started traveling around China and visiting professional dance schools in about 20 provinces and autonomous regions, as well as professional dance ensembles. And I collected, at the time, about 150 oral history interviews. And then over the subsequent years, I have increased that now to over 200. That also laid an important foundation for understanding and exploring the history of Chinese dance. So my doctoral dissertation, which I completed in 2011, was highly ethnographic and was really focused on that field research in Beijing during that period. And Revolutionary Bodies, actually, for those of you who may have read the dissertation and the book, know that it's actually 2 different projects. So I went back to the drawing board with Revolutionary Bodies because I realized that while the ethnographic research was extremely valuable, it could only really provide insight to the contemporary moment. And so in order to really appreciate a lot of the changes that were happening in the contemporary dance field and in the Chinese dance field when I was doing my field research, it actually required a longer historical understanding of the development of this dance practice. And so for the book, I decided to shift away from the ethnographic methodology and actually used a historical methodology. So I started to really focus on the textual documentation, such as performance programs, performance reviews, as well as writings by dancers and choreographers that had been published in Chinese dance magazines, as well as Chinese newspapers and other periodicals, actually going back to the 1930s. And then I supplemented that with analysis of dance films dating back to the 1940s, as well as photographs published in these publications, as well as in dancers' private archives. And so I used actually analysis of all of that historical material as the basis for the book. And then in the last chapter of the book is chronological, as I'll talk about in a little bit. The last chapter brings us to the 21st century and actually does use a little bit more of that ethnographic material, but the previous 5 chapters are all primarily based on the historical research.
It's such a rich book, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And I know you're going to go into further detail in your presentation. We're going to hop forward to another book that you've published just a couple of years after Revolutionary Bodies. And this is Corporeal Politics, Dancing East Asia, published by the University of Michigan Press, which you collaborated with Catherine Misa from the University of California, Irvine. Corporeal Politics is a collection of essays that thread East Asia, dance, politics, and the role of dance as a medium for transcultural interaction and communication across borders. Could you elaborate on why this second book is of particular relevance to understanding critical studies on East Asia, and also really sort of border crossing into critical dance studies?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I actually have both books here, so I'm just going to hold them up for people who may not have seen them. So Revolutionary Bodies, Corporeal Politics. So Corporeal Politics is an edited collection, and over half of the authors who contributed essays are actually based in East Asia. The other half are based in North America. And the origins of this collection actually also date back to the time that I was in graduate school at Berkeley. In 2010, Catherine and I organized a conference because we felt that the field of East Asian dance studies was just kind of starting to emerge. And at the time, we actually struggled to populate an entire conference of scholars because there just weren't enough people yet in the United States who were actually doing in-depth research on dance in East Asia. So we had a mix of scholars in dance, like Judy Van Zyl was there, for example, San Kwan was there. And then we had a lot of scholars coming from Asian theater studies, which was Catherine's background, as well as scholars in adjacent fields such as anthropology, for example. And in the time span from 2010 to 2020, when the book was published, the field has actually expanded quite significantly. So we were able to publish, an entire book of scholarship on dance in East Asia, which really reflects the growth of the field. And so in putting the book together, one of the things that we really emphasized was the importance of interdisciplinarity. And we really wanted to feature and highlight the ways in which scholars with expertise in East Asian studies, whether that's literary studies or historical studies, or for example, could actually contribute really significantly to the field of dance studies. So for example, I invited Beverly Bosler, who is a very established leading scholar in the history of women's social history in China in the medieval period. And I knew that she was a ballet dancer and had an interest in dance. And of course, as an expert on women's culture and court culture, she had really special insight into the role of female dancers in the imperial courts in China. And so she wrote an essay about that specifically for the volume. And similarly, Susie Kim, who is a historian specializing in the culture of North Korea, I knew that she had some interest in Choi Seung-hee, a leading dancer who spent the latter part of her career in North Korea, and so invited Susie to write a chapter on Choi Seung-hee's career in North Korea. So these are both topics that we know needed to be written about. There was no one really available in the dance studies field to do that, and so we curated the book in a way that we could bring forth some really important stories that are, we felt there was a need for research on those topics, and we found the right people to write about them. But then we also featured scholars who are just completing, new dissertations, for example. So Tara Rodman had just finished her dissertation on Ito Michio, and Nanma had just recently finished her dissertation on modern dance in China. So we also invited them to publish sections of their dissertation research to give a preview to new books that will be coming out in the next couple of years. So there are certain topics in East Asian dance studies that have received some attention previously. So for example, like the revolutionary ballets in China, or Butoh, for example, are topics that there have been quite a significant amount of scholarship. And so we tried to provide alternative angles onto topics of dance in East Asia that had previously not been given as much attention. And so we really wanted to document the growth of the field, but also inspire future researchers. So the introduction to the volume lays forth some of those goals. And also, as the author of the introduction, I also wanted to put forth some theoretical positions that could be taken up in future scholarship. So for example, how to do anti-Orientalist scholarship, and how to bring the use of original materials in East Asian languages in a useful way into dance studies scholarship. Those are some of the issues that, that we're dealing with in the introduction and throughout the book.
They're fabulous. I mean, both books are fabulous. And I know you're quite the pioneer, because you've also co-created the Chinese dance collection at the University of Michigan, as well as you're a pioneer with DSA now in terms of the working group on Asian and Asian diaspora in dance studies. I'm mindful that I want you to get started with your presentation. So maybe we'll come back to some of my questions, and I'll kind of hold back on my latter two questions and hand over to you for your presentation.
Sure, yeah, thank you so much. Let me just get my slides open. So I'm going to drop into the chat the link to Revolutionary Bodies. So this is a book that I published open access thanks to a very generous grant from the University of Michigan. So that means that the book can be freely downloaded. So if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to download the book. And so I'm going to present a shortened version of the book talk that I usually present about the book. If you're interested in seeing the entire talk, there are at least 3 different versions of it on YouTube, so you can easily look it up and find that. And there's even a version in Chinese that I gave as well in Sichuan. So I'll give you just some of the highlights. So as I mentioned, it's an open access book. The book also has this really great feature that University of California Press offered me, which was to have embedded videos. So there are 19 embedded videos in the book that you can either click on here in the digital version or scan a QR code. And 2 of them are actually rare videos. You can see one of these here of Dai Ailian performing some of her earliest choreographies of Chinese dance in 1947. So if you're interested in Dai Ailian, I encourage you to check those out. So the book focuses on Chinese dance. And so as we know, within the larger field of dance in China, there are many different genres practiced, right? There are companies dedicated to ballet, to contemporary dance. There are many practitioners of hip hop, street dance, as well as dance sport, for example. So dance in China is quite a diverse field. And within that diverse field, my book focuses mostly on dance forms that Chinese dance scholars consider to be Chinese. And so primarily this is Chinese classical dance, Chinese ethnic minority dance, as well as Chinese folk dance or Han folk dance of different regions. And so the book is really an investigation of how this specific genre of dance that's called Chinese dance came about, what were the theories behind this dance practice, and also how can we understand its history, both in terms of choreography as well as pedagogy, as well as theory in China. So these are the 2 main forms that the terms are usually used today, either Chinese national folk dance, sometimes also translated as Chinese ethnic and folk dance, and Chinese classical dance. And so in the book, I talk about how these are actually, Chinese dance is actually the most widely practiced dance style in China and has been since the 1950s. And so there were already scholarships sort of previously existing that looked at Western dance styles in China, and I wanted to do something different and instead focus on Chinese dance. So I've already talked to you about the ethnographic research and the historical research, so I'll skip over this part. And here I want to outline some of the main arguments in the book. So the book is a historical account of the history and development of Chinese dance, and it's laid out chronologically. So one of the first historical points I make in the book is that the origins of this concert dance form that we know today as Chinese dance can be traced back to the 1940s. And this was a period of intensive intercultural exchange in China, as well as both civil war and war between China and Japan, as well as the early period of Chinese revolutionary culture or socialist culture. So the subtitle of the book actually conveys a really important part of the argument, which is Chinese dance and the Socialist Legacy. So I actually argue that Chinese dance is a product of the socialist revolutionary period and of socialist cultural production, which in some people, I think might find that a bit paradoxical. We often think of socialism as being antithetical to tradition, whereas Chinese dance is meant to be an embodiment of Chinese tradition. And so one of my main points is actually that these two things are not antithetical, that in fact, socialist ideology and culture really valued aesthetic traditions insofar as they could come to represent a national identity and a national culture, which is what Chinese dance served to do in that context. One of the other interesting points that I make in the first chapter of the book is that even though Chinese dance is a national dance form that represents the nation, many of its early creators themselves embodied identities that were on the margins of what we might consider to be Chinese identity. So for example, Dai Ailian is one of the leading figures that I trace in the first chapter and that I regard as one of the founders of Chinese dance. And she did not even speak Chinese language growing up. She was a third generation Chinese diaspora woman born and raised in Trinidad and trained in London. Who did not go to China until she was 24 years old. And then she rose to become one of the central figures in this dance form. So she, as well as other interesting figures such as Kambar Han, who is an ethnic minority dancer of Uyghur ethnicity, as well as Chesun Hee, who is a Korean dancer from Korea, all I consider to be founding figures of Chinese dance. And the fact that they came from such diverse personal identity backgrounds, I think also helps us to complicate our understanding of Chinese dance as necessarily a nationalistic art form. Also, of course, and like in many dance histories, women are really central to the story. And I think this is quite important, especially in the field of modern Chinese studies, where a lot of the fields that we typically look at, such as literature, film, visual culture, and even music, tend to be dominated by male figures. In the dance field, we get a different story of contemporary China, where women are really at the center. So in the second chapter of the book, I look at how Chinese dance flourished in the early period of the People's Republic of China. So the construction of socialist culture. This was a period when Chinese dance in the form of Chinese classical dance and Chinese folk and ethnic dance were institutionalized as China's leading national dance form, and were also sent around the world on tours, as well as to participate in World Youth Festivals in Eastern Europe, for example. And so one of the points that I make in this chapter is that traditionally, the Maoist era of this period of socialist China has often been described as a time of isolation. And it's true that because of the Cold War, China did find itself politically isolated, especially from the United States and the US allies. But this did not mean that China was actually entirely isolated from the world. And in fact, we see a huge amount of cultural exchange happening in the dance field at that time between China and many other parts of the world. And so that's one of the other points that I document and really highlight in that discussion. I then turned to, so in chapter 4, I turned to this really interesting relationship between ballet and Chinese dance, because the way that the dance field developed in China, while Chinese dance was the focus, ballet was sort of always part of the picture on a smaller scale. So while the first several professional dance companies that were established in China at the national level were dedicated to Chinese dance, one of those companies was actually a ballet company. So we know today as the Central Ballet of China, or the National Ballet of China, was founded initially as a branch of the Beijing Dance School in 1959, and then it became an independent company at the end of 1963. So ballet was there, but it was actually not the focus. And there was a contentious relationship between ballet and Chinese dance. So oftentimes within the Chinese dance field, you would see scholars and practitioners sort of comparing Chinese dance to ballet, regarding Chinese dance as the opposite of ballet, as sort of a challenge or a response to ballet's hegemonic status. And so I discussed the ways in which Chinese dance was discursively envisioned as the representation of the Chinese self, whereas ballet was discursively produced as an embodiment of the Western other. And that this dichotomous relationship was actually productive in the sense that it drove a lot of the innovation in Chinese dance. It also drove a lot of the theorization and a lot of the pedagogical development as well. So you would repeatedly see Chinese dance teachers writing in the dance magazines about how they needed to make sure not to allow ballet technique to encroach on Chinese dance. There was always this perception of a threat that ballet would encroach because ballet had such an important status internationally. So this relationship is really interesting. And it's not until the Cultural Revolution, which breaks out in 1966, that we actually see ballet emerge for the first time as the focus and actually an officially endorsed dance style that was after 1966 treated as the only style that was officially endorsed. And that was a complete reversal and a complete change from the previous policy prior to 1966. So that whole history is really fascinating. And I also talk in that chapter about how in the years leading up to the Cultural Revolution in 1966, there was a lot of experimentation happening in the dance world. So beyond Chinese classical dance and Chinese ethnic and folk dance, you started to have dances being created by Chinese companies that were experimenting, for example, with international dance forms from other parts of Asia. You also start to see dances that were created about topics happening outside China, such as the Vietnam War or the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. And you get to start to see the blending of different styles. And so revolutionary ballet, which are ballets about the Chinese Revolution that are actually being danced using ballet technique, is one of the experiments that emerges as that time. And that becomes the dominant form during the 10-year period from 1966 to 1976, which is known commonly as the Cultural Revolution era. In the wake of the Cultural Revolution, interestingly, for those who are familiar with Chinese history, you know that there was a pretty strong ideological shift in the late 1970s. So Mao Zedong, who had been the leader of the Chinese Revolutionary Movement, more or less dating back to the 1930s, passed away in 1976. And Zhou Enlai, who was sort of the second in command throughout this period, also passed away within a very short period of time, also in 1976. This was a really key turning point. After that happened, the Cultural Revolution ended. Several of the political figures who had been leaders in the Cultural Revolution were actually put on trial. There was a public trial. And so there was a period of intense reflection on the previous period and a lot of critical reflection. So in this context, ballet actually started to be critiqued. The revolutionary ballets themselves went out of fashion, and there was a moment of revival of Chinese dance. And so interestingly, one of the points that I make in chapter 5 is that in this period that is often described as a post-Mao period or a post-socialist period, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, when you start to see China implement the market reforms, moving more towards the sort of Western model in society and culture, you ironically actually have a return to the dance styles that were being promoted at the early height of socialist culture, which of course were Chinese dance. And so this is the period that I see as the second flourishing of Chinese dance, which starts in the late 1970s and actually continues all the way to the present. So this critique of the Cultural Revolution actually made it possible for Chinese dance to reemerge as the dominant nationally supported dance form in China. Of course, in the 1980s and 90s, you also start to see the rise of modern dance, especially introduced from the United States. This is something I don't talk about too much in the book because I know there are other scholars writing about it. And so I kind of wanted to leave that space open. And also that has been written about in previous books as well. I'd be happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. And then I kind of jump from the 1980s and I jump forward to the 21st century to talk more about the legacies of the socialist period of Chinese dance, and also draw on that field work that I spoke of earlier, where I could really reflect on sort of the Chinese dance culture that existed in the 2000s and the 2010s. And so I analyze a number of key performances, and I also discuss the ways in which choreographers have continued to expand upon some of the earlier practices in their work. So I think we have about 7 minutes left, so I'll just go through some of the visuals that go along with these points that I've made. So these are the figures that I see as the founders of Chinese dance, this really diverse group that I mentioned earlier: Dai Ailian, Kamber Han, Chesing He, and Liang Lun. And so I won't have time to go through all of the details right now, but hopefully by looking at the images, you'll get a sense of just the really interesting diversity of the stylistic and aesthetic backgrounds of these founding figures. So Chesing He is the person whose images we're seeing here, and I've written a number of other articles about her. I'd be more than happy to talk more about her. Liang Lun was the only one of these early founders who was from China. He was a student of Wu Xiaobang, who I showed just a minute earlier. He's important enough that we can go back for him. So Wu Xiaobang on the right here is considered, along with Dai Ailian, to be one of the founders of dance in China in the modern period. And he was actually someone who had studied German expressionist dance as it was being taught in Japan in the 1930s. And so he was early on actually not very interested in Chinese folk and classical dance. He really wanted to promote modern dance in China, but that was not what was picked up sort of by the Chinese Communist Party, which had a much stronger emphasis on building a distinctively Chinese dance form. So Wu Xiaobang is an interesting figure because he remains in a leadership role throughout the period, but oftentimes his ideas are not actually the dominant ones in the national dance system, even though he's working in that system. So in terms of the theoretical contributions of the book, so I just went through some of the historical arguments, but I do have some theoretical contributions that I think are worth discussing here. So so I argue that while Chinese dance is very diverse and has changed and throughout time, there are some distinguishing central values in Chinese dance that are repeatedly espoused by Chinese dance practitioners. You see it again and again in the theoretical writings by dancers, and you also see it in the choreographic choices and in the pedagogical choices that the dancers make. So these commitments appear not only in the sort of discursive space, but also in the practice of Chinese dance. So when I reflected back to say, okay, how can we define Chinese dance? What are the sort of defining features of this form? So these were the ones that I highlighted as those defining features. So the first one is this pursuit of a dance form that through its form, through the dance technique, can somehow express a national culture of China. And so this is something we see from the very beginning that continues to be very, very important part of Chinese dance practice today, which is this enduring pursuit of a dance form that can somehow embody Chinese culture. It's a very difficult and very problematic in some ways idea, but this is the idea that motivates new choreography, that motivates new pedagogical design, motivates theoretical research. And so it's really, really central to what Chinese dance is. There's no one form, but the idea is that if a particular form is considered to be part of Chinese dance, somehow it should embody kinesthetic nationalism. The second core value or core commitment that we see throughout this history is a really clear and explicit concept that China is an ethnically and geographically diverse country, and that dance from China should therefore reflect that diversity. So we see a really strong emphasis on representing different ethnic or nationalities, ethnic groups or nationalities in China. And we also see a really explicit emphasis on representing different geographical regions of the country. So there are dance styles of particular provinces or even particular counties. And so this idea of geographic and ethnic diversity is sort of at the heart of the dance form. And then lastly, this idea that Chinese dance, while it embodies national culture, is not static, is really central to how Chinese dance practitioners have understood what they're doing and approached this dance form. So I refer to this idea as dynamic inheritance, and I also have a separate article specifically dealing with this concept. But the idea is that choreographers and teachers and practitioners of Chinese dance embrace their own responsibility to continuously revise and reinterpret the form to make it appealing to contemporary audiences and sort of capable of expressing contemporary concerns. And I think this is very important because in the Anglophone world of dance studies, the way we talk about dance in the English language, we tend to associate terms like classical dance or terms like folk or ethnic dance with something that is meant to be preserved. And there's often an assumption made that if it changes or if it appears to be too choreographed or too modern, somehow it's no longer authentic. And so I think this idea of dynamic inheritance is really critical because it brings us back to the discourses of the dancers themselves in China, in which they are actually not in pursuit of some kind of static authenticity. They're actually explicitly in pursuit of a dynamic kind of cultural embodiment. And they will actually explicitly say traditions are not static. Traditions are constantly renewed with each generation over time. And so I think it's important that we understand that in order to avoid making judgments about Chinese dance that are actually not rooted in the discourses of the practitioners themselves. And so I do a lot of analysis in the book. Pretty much all the sources that I use for the most part are in Chinese language. So I translate a lot of the original, writings of these dancers. And that's a really important commitment that I had in the book, because I wanted readers to be able to directly read what these dancers were writing in the Chinese context. So I also analyzed a lot of the visual material that we have of these dance histories, as most dance historians do. And so, as I said, the book is chronological. So this is giving you a sense of some of the dance works that I analyze. So some of the dances that I analyze in the book no longer have video documentation. So these are two examples. And I reconstruct them in the book based on the textual documentation as well as the still images. And so that's an important contribution of the book as well, is to reconstruct some of the dances that we no longer have recordings of. So I think we're running at time, so I'll just go through some of these images and they might spark some questions for people, and maybe they'll spark some interest in exploring the book further. And this again sort of illustrates the historical narrative that I spoke of earlier. So in chapter 3, when I'm discussing the institutionalization of Chinese dance, I also have a section where I analyze Chinese dance dramas. These are full-length narrative dance productions that use Chinese dance vocabulary. And this has also been a really central feature of Chinese dance dating back to the 1950s, continues to be one of the main formats of Chinese dance choreography today. So I'll just go through. This is the section on ballet history and sort of its relationship to Chinese dance. This is a section on the revival of Chinese dance. So I focus specifically on the peacock dance and Dunhuang style dance, which are two of the really dominant styles of Chinese dance today, very popular styles of Chinese dance today that really were crystallized in that second flourishing era of the late 70s and the early 80s. And then lastly, I talk about the many spaces in which which Chinese dance is flourishing today, including the online dance competitions, as well as the new choreography in which dancers are really pushing the boundaries of these art forms. So I think I'll end there and open it up for either the remaining two questions we didn't get to earlier or the questions from the audience. So thank you.
Oh, so much choice, Emily. I think before we go forwards, I just want to kind of, you know, these sort of Chinese dance dramas, which really sort of seem to be very much driven by, of course, Chinese culture. And on page 13, where you, on your chapter on Dai Ailian, you describe the way she moves. And I'm wondering whether you can put up a photograph of Dai Ailian, because she emerges dressed in a folkloric costume of red balloon pants and a rose-colored silk jacket, a ring of red flowers in her hair, and shoes topped with red pom-poms, puppet-like. And you go on to describe some of the narratives out of the ballet, or the adaptation of The Mute Carries the Cripple. And I'm wondering to what extent you still see maybe some of these continuums of Dai Ailian in the work. Ah, there it is.
Yeah.
Maybe we might want to just watch her a little bit, just.
Sure.
We can pause there, Emily.
Sure.
I had some thoughts about, or I just maybe wanted you to just maybe expand a little bit on how, you know, what are your thoughts on the role of the movement vocabulary and how that sort of maybe typifies what Ailian did in her repertory work, and how it sort of maybe became that sort of identity of Chinese dance. Could you maybe sort of expand on the role of, you know, Ailian and how this particular repertoire might sort of, you know, typify not just that period, but also maybe the legacy through into the 21st century?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much for asking that question. So Dai Ailian is just such an interesting figure. As I mentioned earlier, she was born in Trinidad and she was trained in England. So she started studying ballet in Trinidad. She was the only dancer of Chinese ethnicity, the only non-white dancer, as she recounts it in her oral history, in her class in Trinidad. And then in England, she also was often the only Asian dancer in many of the companies and schools that she studied at. So she studied at Dartington Hall for about one semester. And she also studied with Anton Dolan, Marie Rambert, some of the leading figures, Margaret Krask. She also studied some German modern dance as well at Dartington, and also with an earlier company. She danced with the Ernst and Lottie Burke mask dance company for a while. So before she came to China, her training was in ballet and German expressionist dance. And she recognized that while there were dancers in London, you know, performing, there were Indonesian dancers. Uday Shankar, of course, was well known performing South Asian dance. Ram Gopal. There were people performing Southeast Asian and South Asian dance. Chesing He had toured Europe around this time as well in the late 1930s, but there wasn't anyone from China doing Chinese dance apart from people knew of, like actors such as Mei Lan Fang, for example. And so she went to China with this goal of studying Chinese dance and of being able to represent China. And interesting, while she was in London, she did perform at the political rallies to gain support for China during the Sino-Japanese War. This was an important moment of sort of bringing together the Chinese diaspora in starting in 1937. So the China Campaign Committee was the main group that put together some of these events. And so she did perform Chinese themed works, but as she describes it, they were based on her imagination of what Chinese dance might be, based on, statues that she saw in the art museums in London, and based on readings that she did or photographs that she found. So when she went to China, she first arrived in Hong Kong in 1940, and then she moved to Chongqing, which is a city in southwest China that borders a lot of the areas that have large ethnic minority communities. And so in the early 1940s, she conducted field research because she wanted to learn authentic Chinese movement. And so one of the sites that she did field research was in Guangxi, and that's where she studied this piece, Mute Carries a Cripple, which is originally a segment of a theatrical production of a Chinese opera piece performed in the local dialect opera known as Gui opera. And so she drew on that. And of course, we can see here, she adapted it into a dance work with the fan movements. And it includes a lot of like the eye movement, and the fingers that you saw in the earlier part of that are very reminiscent of Chinese opera movement. And so this choice to use Chinese opera as the basis for Chinese dance was something that Dai Ailian did. It was also something that other dancers did at the time, and that became very central to the movement vocabulary, particularly of Chinese classical dance. So most of the movement vocabulary of Chinese classical dance has some connection to Chinese opera movement. In the conventional styles. There have been some newer styles of Chinese classical dance that developed in the 1980s, 70s and 80s that drew on other sources such as Buddhist paintings, as well as historical texts and documents from ancient China. But most of what is standard classroom vocabulary that's taught as Chinese classical dance is very closely related to Chinese opera. So we can definitely see a direct connection there to this piece. And then on the left, you can see another image of Dai Ailian, and here she's actually performing a Tibetan dance piece. So in addition to drawing inspiration from local Chinese opera performance, she also conducted field research with groups that are now today known in China as ethnic minority groups. So groups that are not part of the dominant Han ethnicity. And so Tibetan is one of those groups. And so she traveled with her husband, who was a Chinese painter, to the far west of what is now Sichuan province, which borders on the Tibetan region. And she studied, and actually she practiced Labo notation. When she was at Dartington Hall, she learned Labo notation. So she did Labo notation of these Tibetan dances, and then she adapted them into her own choreography. And this also continues to be a very dominant sort of practice in Chinese dance today, where people will conduct field research and then adapt the movement vocabulary into like a conservatory movement style. And that's what she did with Tibetan dances. This is showing that she did that with a number of other ethnic minority dances as well.